For those who I haven't met yet, I'm Blair Taylor. I'm the Program Director of the ISC, and this is the Understanding and Overcoming Capitalism section. Basically, we're going to hand things over here shortly to Peter, who's going to spend a good 30-40 minutes talking about the core features of capitalism, how we understand capitalism, why that matters. I'm going to pick up a little bit after that, elaborate a little bit more on the question of why that matters, how our analysis points us in different political directions. Something social ecology, as you might have picked up on at this point, is always very focused on. How does our critique determine our reconstructive vision, and always being aware that we don't have critiques of capitalism on ecocide and any of the issues that we're discussing. So it's very important to think very carefully and critically about the way we frame those issues so that we make sure we point in emancipatory and ecological directions. We'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll talk about the third section on, well, what can we do about it? What have been some past attempts to confront and overcome capitalism? How have they succeeded? How have they failed? And what does social ecology advocate? So with that, I'll turn things over to Peter. And Peter, I'll let you give yourself a little intro for those that didn't meet you already in the previous section.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Is the audio good? This works? Awesome. Thanks for being here. Thanks for coming back, for those of you who were here yesterday. Blair did a great job of sort of encapsulating what we want to do for the next 2.5 hours or something ridiculously long like that. I don't know why the session is that long, but the idea is to both try to understand capitalism better, but for the reason of so that we can challenge it better. It's both understanding and overcoming capitalism. So if we get to 4 o'clock and we have not yet overcome capitalism, then we've done something wrong. But that's how social ecologists approach this question. And since Blair mentioned I haven't quote met unquote a lot of you yet, for those who don't know me, I have been teaching this course at the ISC, or a version of this course, and often co-teaching versions of this course for many, many years. I'm not even sure when is the first time I showed up and co-taught with Darini. Dan, hi, anybody remember that? Maybe 1999, about 20 years or so. And every single time that we teach the course, I would start out by saying, capitalism is in crisis. I'm sure I've said that every time I've taught it. And the thing is, this is not funny. It's a little funny to me. It's not funny because millions of people's livelihoods are at stake right now around the world. But the thing is, that claim is so much more true right now than it's been any other time that I've taught this course. Capitalism is genuinely in crisis. Capitalism is in severe crisis right now in 2020. We don't know what the world is going to look like 3 months from now, much less 3 years from now. So I have tried, when I've been thinking through how to pitch this Zoom version of the course for today, I've been trying to think long and hard about the ways that might change our perspective. But to give the rest of you a little bit of historical background, social ecologists have been opposed to capitalism all along for 40, 50 years now, and that's worth noting. That was true long before a critique of capitalism became more or less the norm in activist circles in North America. That process, I would say, really kicked in the latter half of the 1990s and then took off in the aughts, in the early 2000s. Social ecologists, for what it's worth, we were trying to offer what we saw as a principled and comprehensive critique of capitalism for a long time before that, and it made us look a little weird for a while there. A lot of us here who've been involved in the ISC can remember themselves any number of meetings of the Green Movement, for example, in the United States, where we were virtually the only people saying, yeah, but what about capitalism? And the others would say, capitalism? What are you talking about? Every American believes in capitalism. How can you attack the capitalist system? So what we would try to do is explain that we are anti-capitalists in principle, that social ecologists aren't just opposed to capitalism because it does a bunch of bad stuff, which is absolutely true. We're not just opposed to capitalism because it exacerbates the astonishing racial wealth gap in this country right now. It does do that, that's true, but it's not the reason that social ecologists are opposed to capitalism. We're not opposed to capitalism because it burns fossil fuels at an astonishing rate and pumps greenhouse gases into the air. Also true, we're not opposed to capitalism because it makes most of us, most of the time, spend large chunks of our days working for a wage at jobs where we usually have extremely little control over the work that we do. That's also true. All of those things are true about capitalism. From a social ecology perspective, as true as those things are, we would basically say we're opposed to capitalism at its core, in its innermost structures. We would still be opposed to capitalism if you could somehow come up with a form of capitalism that did not do all of those bad things. If you could somehow create or invent or reform your way into a racially equitable form of capitalism, a gender equitable form of capitalism, we would be opposed to capitalism. This one's a little harder to imagine, but we would be opposed to capitalism if you could somehow come up with an environmentally sustainable version of the capitalist system. Actually, social ecologists would argue that's impossible. We think that the system itself is fundamentally flawed. It is flawed in its own principles and in its own structures. So that's a lot of what the first part of our discussion today is going to focus on. What do we think capitalism even means? And as Blair put it, why does that matter? Because it actually matters a lot. The way we, each of us, the way any of us here analyzes and assesses and explains and conceives of capitalism, that can have a very profound effect on what we do about it. What we do about it in our personal lives, in our work lives, in our activist lives, with the groups that we are members of, and so on and so forth. So what I am going to offer is, in general, a social ecology take on those questions, but it's also very much my own take on those questions. It's not the case that everybody involved in the Institute for Social Ecology, at least it's not necessarily the case that we all agree on all of these issues. In fact, we have been vigorously disagreeing about them for many, many years. That's one of the great things about social ecology is you can have ongoing, often very firm and emphatic debates. So you're going to hear the Peter Staudenmeier version of that critique, but I very much want to make clear that's not my way of saying this is how it is, folks, deal with it. I mean this critique as a way to start a radical debate and a radical conversation about what do we mean by capitalism, where do we think it came from, what do we think its basic operating principles are. Okay. The thing that I like to start out with is by showing, not just pointing out that capitalism is in crisis, as it is manifestly right now all around us, but also pointing out that capitalism has been in crisis many, many, many times before. If we were holding this course in the early 1930s, for example, oh, that was a time when capitalism was in crisis around the globe. If this was the middle of the Great Depression, etc., anybody who's paid attention to, even brief attention to, the historical development of capitalism is aware that capitalism is a way of continually generating new crises for itself. But, and here's the really important thing, capitalism also has an amazing ability, an amazing kind of flexibility. It has an amazing ability to adapt itself to different social conditions. It can adapt itself to many different kinds of societies. It can adapt itself to many different kinds of environmental and ecological conditions. And that is something I think we need to really take seriously. There's not just one version of capitalism that we're going to need to overcome, as the words of the title of this session have it. There's dozens and dozens, potentially hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of capitalism that we are eventually going to need to challenge and confront, and with a little luck, overcome and get past them. So with that in mind, what I want to suggest is a series of core features that I think are more or less essential to the operations of capitalism as such. Blair mentioned I have that little text, which I guess is it's on the website somewhere that folks can read, and that text gives you an expanded version of my personal catalog. I'm gonna point to four different what I think are the four primary core features of capitalism, but they're definitely not the only ones. That's part of the reason why I want to generate a debate and a conversation around this, is what do each of you include or not include in your list of what counts as core features of capitalism. The reason I think that's important is because there's there's a sort of a fundamental feature of capitalism as a society, capitalism as a social form, not just capitalism as an economic form, although I'm going to primarily talk about its economic aspects today. It's actually much broader than that. Capitalism is a whole form of life, a way of running a society. And one of its strange but conspicuous features is capitalism is very good at obscuring its own structures. It's very good at hiding its own operations. There's something strange about the way that capitalism works that makes it harder rather than easier for those of us living within a capitalist world. It makes it harder for us to figure out, wait, what's actually going on here? Who actually controls what? Where are decisions being made? Where is the, if you believe that money is a big part of it, where is the money flowing? What direction? Whose work is going into whose pocket, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And because I think that's a very important and very challenging feature of modern capitalism, I want to offer these four core features that I'm going to propose in a second. I want to offer them as a starting point for how we can break through that kind of veneer that capitalist societies build around themselves. I want us to realize that all of us actually probably know a whole lot more about capitalism than we might realize. You feel like, it's like you live in a society where you feel like you need a PhD in economics to make even basic sense of the morning news when you wake up. And I think that's a bit of a deception. I think we are, for those of us who grew up in capitalist societies, and I don't want to make assumptions about where the rest of you are from, but I certainly grew up in a hyper-capitalist society here in the United States. For those of us who come from that kind of background, I think we actually know a whole lot more about the workings of the system than we necessarily realize much of the time. So that's my starting point for this analysis. So I mentioned that I would put forward four basic building blocks. And the first one that I'm going to start with is something that's often called commodity production. In fact, that's a term that I nakedly stole from 150 years of Marxist analysis. I happen to be a critic of Marxism myself, but I also think that Marxism, some versions of Marxism, have been enormously productive and creative in trying to come up with analyses of capitalism that both make sense of it as a system and then also offer the rest of us tools for how to confront it and challenge it as a system. And one of the main insights that Marx had was that commodities are somehow or other, in a way that we have to unravel and unpack, the commodities are at the center of what capitalism does. If you're not used to the notion of a commodity, maybe the best way to think about it is that a commodity is something that is produced in order to be exchanged. It's not something that's necessarily produced because, gosh, I'd really like to have a new pair of shoes. I've worn out the ones I'm wearing right now, and I kind of need shoes to go walk around outside. So I'd really like a new pair of shoes. And I just happen to have a friendly neighbor who's a cobbler, who's a shoemaker. Is that what a cobbler is? I'm not even sure that's the word for it anymore. A person who makes shoes. My neighbor is a shoemaker. So, hey, buddy, you want to make me a pair of shoes? And you can come over and we'll cook you dinner and I'll do whatever it is that I'm capable of doing, which is very, very little, but I'll do whatever I can for you and we'll do something like that. In a capitalist system, that's not why shoes get made. In a capitalist system, normally, shoes get made because the shoemaking company has figured, we bet that we can sell 750,000 of this particular item if we find the right price point and if we market it the right way and we get the good advertising, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Commodities are things that are produced in order to be exchanged. The fact that some of those commodities happen to be useful to some people in some conditions, in some places, and sometimes, that fact is secondary from the point of view of why they are produced. In fact, a whole lot of the commodities that get produced under capitalism are useful to nobody ever. A whole lot of commodities that get produced should never be produced, should never be used. Let's hope some of them are not used, depending on what it is that's being created. So a commodity in that sense is something that has been put into economic circulation for the purpose of being exchanged somehow or other, not primarily for the purpose of being useful or being helpful or what have you. So that would be my number one component is that capitalism has to have some sort of commodity production built into it somewhere or other. My second one flows directly from that. If what I just said is true, that commodities are things that are produced in order to be exchanged, then you need a way to exchange them. You need a place or a forum or a mechanism through which they could be exchanged. And that's going to bring up my second core feature, and that is markets. Capitalism depends on markets, depends on lots and lots and lots of different markets, or some theorists of capitalism would say that actually it's all one big interconnected market, that in effect, from a capitalist point of view, the entire social world is one big marketplace. Now that's an interesting term. The notion of the market as a place, that phrase, the marketplace, is actually kind of telling, because historically, there is something to that. Lots of different human societies, long before the historical rise of capitalism, setting aside for a moment the question of when exactly and where exactly did capitalism rise, historians and economists are in utter disagreement about that question, so I'm not going to bother with it right now, but it did arise in some places and some times before the historical emergence of capitalism, and in some societies well after the historical emergence of capitalism. Lots of different human societies have had markets. They've had all sorts of different markets. The difference was, in those non-capitalist societies, markets were generally a subordinate part of everything else that was going on in economic life. They were not the central mechanism, far from it. They were often very peripheral. And that's where the notion of a marketplace comes from. A lot of non-capitalist societies had specifically marked out particular spots, particular geographical locations where it was okay to engage in market exchange, where it was socially acceptable to go to that particular place, but not the rest of your community, to go to that particular place and buy and sell goods and services and such. That's the historical origin of the whole word, the whole term, the whole notion of a marketplace. So those marketplaces were usually either or both geographically restricted. There were particular places where you could engage in market exchange, and or they were often temporally restricted. They were restricted in terms of the times at which it was socially acceptable to engage in market exchange, whether particular times of day, particular days of the week, particular months of the year. Once capitalism comes along historically, it sweeps away all of those limitations. And it takes the market from having been a peripheral kind of marginal player within a much larger non-market economy, and it makes markets central. In a capitalist economy, it's hard to do virtually anything at all in the economic realm without somehow getting yourself involved in market exchange. It's not impossible. There's versions of cooperatives and collectives that offer us at least brief respite from that, brief refuges from that process. But in general, markets are the main mechanism in a capitalist economy for how stuff gets distributed. And not just stuff. I sometimes fall into a bad habit of describing commodities as if they were always physical items. Like I talked about shoes before, the shoes that I'm wearing right now. Actually, commodities can be anything at all. A commodity does not have to be a physical object. It can be a service. It can be an idea. It can be a feeling. It can be all sorts of different things. And the point is that under capitalism, those things, in a very, very broad sense, they get exchanged through a market mechanism. And that mechanism is built around competition. Markets do not work if there's not competition. You can ask the most diehard capitalist you know. I know a lot of diehard capitalists. Ask any of them and they'll say, yeah, of course you need competition to have a functioning market. That's the whole point. So from a capitalist point of view, competition via markets is essential to the whole. And that brings us to the third of my four core components of capitalism, and that is private property. If you think about it, nothing else that I've said so far would make any sense if we all just owned everything communally. If everything belonged to everybody already, then it wouldn't even have any meaning to say that I'm producing something for exchange. What? I'm going to a market to exchange. What are you talking about? We already own everything communally. Under capitalism, many, many things are not owned communally. know things, but many important, some would argue the most important aspects of the economy under a capital society, they are subject to private ownership. They are parts of private property. And many anti-capitalists, most anti-capitalists, argue that that is a big problem. And we don't mean, when we talk about private property, many of us don't mean things like, there's no reason I should not have my pair of shoes. I'm the one who wears them. I'm not sure anyone else wants to wear my stinky shoes after I've worn them. That's not the kind of private property that anti-capitalists are talking about. There's no issue with having your own toothbrushes, having your own shirts. I'm wearing my social ecology shirt right now. Those things are completely okay. A lot of anti-capitalists would say those things aren't really property to begin with. Those things are just personal possessions. I have no problem with personal possessions. Depending on the nature of those possessions, I might have a problem with it. But in general, in principle, I see no objection to that. Private property means when the things that are necessary for communal economic life as a whole, when those things are privately owned, that's a problem. That's what makes them capitalist. When the land that you live on is privately owned, when the building that you live in is privately owned and you have to pay rent, when the workplace that you go to is privately owned and your work is going into someone else's, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When the things you need just to live and eat and breathe and clothe yourself, when all of those things, or many of those things, are privately owned, that is, I would argue, one of those core components of a capitalist system, and one that many of us want to overcome. And that's possibly, of all of the features that I've talked about so far, that might be the most controversial one. For a whole lot of folks in many different societies around the world, if you said, yeah, we kind of want to get beyond markets, yeah, we'd love to get beyond commodity production, they'd all say, yeah, okay, I'm cool with that. Yeah, we want to abolish private property. Whoa, private property, we want to abolish private property. That's actually that's a challenging thought for some legitimate reasons, for some not so legitimate reasons. But I want to note that at least in my version of a social ecology critique of capitalism, it's actually going to be a required part of an eventual overcoming of capitalism. Okay, my fourth and last point, I also think flows from those first three, but I have to make a bit of a jump to get there. And that fourth point I would call exploited labor. Everything else we've been talking about so far depends on the assumption that somebody somewhere is doing the physical labor, or sometimes the non-physical labor, sometimes the emotional labor, sometimes the mental labor, what have you, that somebody somewhere is doing labor that's generating all of these things that are somehow circulating through the marketplace as commodities being exchanged, being owned, being subject to private property, et cetera, et cetera. The people who generate those things, whatever they might be, are workers. However we might understand our own position within the vast economic order, most people, most of the time in most societies, are workers. That's actually not a particularly radical claim. You can get conservatives to agree to that claim. You can get liberals to agree to that claim. Lots of people would, when you think about it, would realize, yeah, most people in most societies are some form of workers. What they're not always is workers who are recognized under capitalism as a form of exploited labor. And that's why this fourth of my four categories is a really tricky one. A lot of other anti-capitalist traditions, some variants of Marxism, for example, tend to focus very strongly on forms of labor that are clearly gendered in lots of ways. The kinds of labor that have, at least in many Western societies, that have typically been performed by men, not exclusively, but typically performed by men. Those are often the kinds of labor that get most easily, most readily recognized as forms of exploited labor. I would like us to push past that. I think there are all sorts of other forms of work that go on in our societies that don't always get recognized as, quote, work, unquote, because they're usually not waged. That's one of the tricky things here. A lot of other anti-capitalist traditions would say wage labor. I myself, Blair might even know this, and some of you might know this, in the early drafts of that little What is Capitalism thing that I wrote some years back, I actually used the term wage labor for what I am now trying to describe as exploited labor. And the more I talked it over with comrades and thought through it and reflected on it, the more I realized that was a mistake on my part. I don't really mean just wage labor. I mean all sorts of different kinds of exploited labor. The exploitation of labor does not I would argue, does not always have to happen via a wage. That gets me in trouble with some orthodox Marxists, and maybe that's even less orthodox Marxists, and maybe that's an opportunity for a good critical debate on the matter. Why I think that last part matters, the notion of exploitation of labor, and the reason I make it my fourth and final point, is that that's the basis of the whole system. If the folks who are doing that labor, the folks who are doing that work, stop doing it, the system collapses in on itself. The market exchange part is going to grind to a halt. The private property part is going to be essentially meaningless. The whole notion of commodity production is not going to happen because the production part is not going to happen. And I want us to recognize that workers, however we define them, I want us to redefine what we think of as workers, but people who put in work in the world have an enormous kind of power. But under capitalism, that power is generally hidden. One of the weird things about commodity production is that it makes it really hard to know who put in the labor for the stuff that you use every day. Let's go back to my shoes. I'm wearing, actually, by my standards, a fairly new pair of shoes. I think I bought them last year, which is pretty new for a guy like me. I wear shoes for years and years and years till I wear them out. I have the faintest idea who made those shoes. I know where I bought them. I can go back to that shop down in downtown Milwaukee where I bought them a year or two ago, but I just don't know who actually did the work. I don't know where the work was done. I probably might be able to kind of sort of figure it out, but it would take a lot of work. And you know what, dude, they're just shoes. I just needed shoes to wear. I got other things to do. I did not put in the effort that it would take, if it was even possible, for me to trace back. That's just one commodity. Think about all the different things that you have used in the course of today, all the different things that we are using right now. Every single one of us is using some form of a computer device. How much does any of us know? Now, some of you actually might have a good answer to that question. Yeah, my computer was made by this radical computer making collective, and I know all of them, and I went over and talked with them. For most of us, I'm going to guess, most of the time, that's probably not the case. That's one of the built-in features of capitalism. And that's one of the big problems with capitalism. It has the effect of alienating most of us from the rest of us. We have a much harder time figuring out how are we all, each of us in our own little ways, how are we all bound up within and tied into this system? Okay, let me do maybe 6 more minutes here, and then we can hand off to Blair and then do some breakouts. What I want to note is that I only mentioned 4 things. I mentioned in passing a few others along the way, but I really only identified specifically these 4 core features. And I want to point out a bunch of stuff that is not on my list. And it's not there for, I've thought through reasons why I think those things don't necessarily belong there, but some of us might disagree about that. So for example, at one point in passing, I mentioned profit. But I conspicuously did not make profit one of my core features. And that could either be a problem with my analysis. You might say that's a weakness, Peter. You haven't factored in the ways that profit is absolutely essential to the functioning of the capitalist economy. Or it might be, actually, there are forms of capitalism that don't foreground profit. They don't make profit front and center in the way that some of us might currently be used to. And if that's true, it's actually a really helpful reminder of something I said at the beginning, that capitalism comes in an enormous variety of forms. The particular form that any one of us might be most immediately familiar with, because it's the one that we live in right now, or the one we grew up with, that is not necessarily the main or the primary, or certainly the only possible form that a capitalist society could take. So I did not, just as one example, I did not include profit as one of my core features. I did not include prices or supply and demand as one of my core features. I didn't say a word about stocks or about bonds or about credit or about lending money at interest, or about, I didn't mention any. I didn't mention the world of finance at all. And again, there's a reason for that, both historically and theoretically, if you will. I think those things are very important to the functioning of today's version of modern North American and Western European capitalism. I do not think that they are absolutely essential or core features of a capitalist society as such. I didn't even really say much about money. I mentioned it in passing at one point, but we could have maybe a productive argument. Do you actually need money to have a functioning capitalist economy? Are there conceivable forms of small-scale capitalism that could somehow get away with not having a form of currency? Last but hardly least, I didn't mention industrial production. I didn't mention factories, for example. I didn't mention smokestacks and assembly lines and all that other stuff. And there's a very good historical reason for that. I am strongly convinced that there are lots of possible kinds and sometimes actual kinds of capitalism that do not depend on having an industrial infrastructure. That's worth pointing out, because some folks, some people who are critical of some aspects of capitalism, part of their vision of the future essentially involves retaining a lot of the core features that I mentioned, retaining versions of commodity production, some versions of private property, certainly versions of market exchange, and even though they wouldn't admit it, probably versions of exploited labor. They want to retain a lot of those things, but have them in a wholly different ecological and social context that has transcended industrialism entirely, or at least in their minds it has transcended, it's left industrialism entirely behind. And my counter argument would there would be, but it's still a capitalist system. It still has fundamental flaws built in it. So that's why I want to put those things out there for discussion. Those of you who have been involved in anti-capitalist movements, again, I don't know enough about the rest of you. I don't know your histories, your backgrounds, what movements you've been involved with, but I'm going to guess that a bunch of you have been at some point involved in things like that. You have surely found yourself in possibly raging debates over things like, yeah, but what if it was just smaller scale? Or, yeah, but what if it was just, where I live in Wisconsin, what if it was just factory farms and mom and pop stores? Wouldn't that be okay? Wouldn't that at least be better than what we have? Well, yeah, it'd be better than what we have now. The question from an anti-capitalist point of view, actually, I saw Blair shaking his head, maybe it would be better than what we have right now. The point of, from a social ecology critique of capitalism, the point is, even if some of us might think those might be the mom and pop stores and the family farm version might be somehow preferable, for those of us lucky to have a family farm or to have a mom and pop store and not having to go work there for money, etc. For those of us who think that might be better in some ways, the real question is, what would it actually change about the underlying social structure? Would those basic social relationships of ownership, lack of ownership, possession, dispossession, being in charge, being a boss, having decision-making power versus I'm the peon who has to carry out the decision that somebody else made who's way above me. If those underlying social structures, if they are not being transformed from a social ecology point of view, that is going to be a great big problem. Okay, usually what I do at this point is transition into talking about how we are not the only anti-capitalists out there, which sadly and excitingly is definitely the case, but I think I'll hold off on that for now. Hand over to Blair, if you're ready to go, Blair, and then we can maybe pick up on some of those things after we do some breaks and breakouts. Thanks, everybody.
Sounds great. Thanks, Peter. As ever, a very comprehensive dive into capitalism. So I want to talk a little bit about why our analysis and critique of capitalism matters, and Peter gave me the perfect segue. One of the texts that was a suggested reading for today was one I wrote in the wake of, or in the midst rather, of the Occupy Wall Street movement called 7 Left Myths About Capitalism. And that emerged directly out of one of those small scale capitalism conversations. So we'll get to that in a minute. But first I want to point out, why does, one question, why does this matter? First of all, we don't all experience capitalism the same way, right? So there's a multiplicity of ways understanding capitalism and therefore framing our critiques. So it depends in part on our social location, on our political tradition, and our understandings and our critiques are going to reflect that. So I want to start just with a very brief kind of brainstorm, digital brainstorm. If people want to just drop in the chat box here, very basic answers to the question, what is wrong with capitalism? If you are an anti-capitalist, what is it about it you find objectionable? If you're not an anti-capitalist, or you're anti-corporate, or you don't consider yourself in this category, how do you understand it? Exploitation and everything. Okay.
Blair, I think that Peter's window is pinned instead of yours.
Thank you so much.
Staring at him.
Thank you for pointing that out. I will
Great.
in my video instead. It's premised on the creation of an oppressed group, dispossession. Minimize the participant view here so I can see more. Ravaging of the planet for resources, privatization, growth, alienation, that's a good one. Work sucks, compartmentalization, turns everything into exploitable resource or a commodity. Money before people, no dignity, wage slavery, rich get richer, poor get poorer, devalues human and animal life, profit over life, working longer than necessary to survive, inequality, bad art, production-oriented success. Yeah, how many times do you start a conversation? People ask you, what do you do? And what they mean is, what do you do for wage labor? How do you sell your labor? As if that is the most necessary or interesting thing about a person's life. Dehumanization, manipulation, these are all great. Having to sell yourself to survive, great. Rent, pay to survive, these are all excellent. What I wanted to spend some time discussing though is the existence of some bad or at least incomplete critiques of capitalism. Places where a particular analysis pointed in very problematic directions, or at least wrong directions. So on the right wing, we can see there are some very definitely scary understandings. We can look at the anti-capitalist, or we can debate if that was actually the case, the anti-capitalist sentiment of National Socialism, which targeted Jews and outsiders and valorized, German labor over external labor. We can look today at forms of xenophobic populism, which again often target Jewish banks or Jewish figures like the financier Soros. But even maybe closer in our own orbits, I mentioned in my talk yesterday, groups like the Wolves of Vinland that are kind of in the alt-right ecological sphere. They have a critique of alienation that in many ways sounds very similar to left-wing critiques. They call it the empire of nothing. They say that capitalism creates a meaningless world. The question, that's in many ways undeniably true, but the question is then, what do you propose as the source of meaning instead of that? It could be race, it could be nation, it could be all kinds of problematic forms that people want to fill the centerless center of capitalist society. So in addition to those right-wing forms, and we could go on and on about other examples, Peter in particular, but there are also a lot of confused left forms. And this goes back really to the very origins of the radical left, the anarchist Bakunin. I know several folks here identify as anarchists. He wrote, "The whole Jewish world constitutes one exploiting sect, one people of leeches, one single devouring parasite, closely and intimately bound together, not only across national boundaries, but also across all divergences of political opinion." So there was a very strong current in the classic workers' movement that saw the problems of capitalism and projected them onto Jews, finance, banks, etc. For this reason, anti-Semitism has often been called the socialism of fools, because it embodies and personifies this abstract system of capitalism that Peter describes so well, and gives it one particular group as a scapegoat. So there's a very close relationship between right-wing, but also just more generally incomplete problematic analysis of capitalism and scapegoating, and especially of anti-Semitism. And we see this today, especially look at all the theories about Soros behind, he's behind everything. He's behind COVID, he's behind the paid protesters that are, protesting white supremacy right now, etc. This has been a consistent current. A little bit closer to home historically, I really came political age in the context of the ultra-globalization movement, which was really kicked off by the Battle of Seattle in 1999. And in that context, there was a very heavy emphasis on anti-corporate and anti-consumerist discourse. And Peter, you mentioned also an anti-advertising orientation. The magazine Adbusters was often identified as kind of the Bible of the anti or ultra-globalization movement. So some of these were also problematic because they only focused on, part of the problem. They focused on size rather than the logic of the society it created. It focused on symptoms like, the ubiquitousness of advertising, which is absolutely annoying, but the kind of assumption was, well, if we got rid of that, then things would be fine. If we went back to this kind of earlier, less obtrusive form of capitalism that Peter mentioned, things somehow go back to normal. So it's not surprising then that a lot of these same ideas popped up when Occupy Wall Street finally emerged as a response to the economic crisis, which is also worth noting took a long time, started in 2008. Occupy pops off in late 2011. So this became the context that I wrote a text called 7 Left Myths About Capitalism. And it emerged specifically, I was there in Zuccotti Park from the first day. And first, it's worth noting that the full scale of divergent and diverse critiques of capitalism were on display. Those first days, it was fully 50% right-wingers. You had people from the Lyndon LaRouche organization. You had all kinds of libertarians protesting against any kind of bailout. You had all kinds of political actors. So I'll say at first, it was not a uniformly or unambiguously left-wing protest. That emerged in the days to come. So after that first day, a handful of us who also mostly knew each other through the context of the ultra-globalization movement in the past went out for dinner, and we're kind of discussing what we found inspiring or problematic about the movement. And I happened to be sitting next to a fellow named Reverend Billy. And some of you might know this, the folks from abroad probably don't, but he is the head of it's called the Reverend Billy and the Church of Stop Shopping, I believe. And he dresses up in this kind of very spectacular, television evangelist style with a white suit and a big pompadour and a really, passionate televangelist style of preaching, but preaching against consumerism. So he was kind of a fixture of the ultra-globalization movement, and he was very prominent also in Occupy Wall Street. They often go outside banks or corporations and kind of, they'll have a church choir, and they'll just be basically presenting a church critique of capitalism. But anyway, we're sitting next to each other, and in the course of the conversation, he starts talking about his alternative to all this was basically, what we need is a form of capitalism that gets back to the kind of Brooklyn bodegas. Again, this is a kind of culturally specific thing, but bodegas are the kind of corner stores that are ubiquitous in Brooklyn. Said, I can go down there and I can leave my kid there. I know the owner, he knows me, we care about each other, we have this relationship. It's not anonymous, to use one of the terms that Dan mentioned. And that all sounds nice, right? But I had to point out, there's some problems with that, Reverend. One of which is a lot of those are small family stores or businesses where it's staffed by especially often female workers who are not paid. It's a family business, and the family basically serves to kind of occlude and hide the exploitation. They don't have health care, they don't have vacations, problematic in so many forms. So to present this kind of binary between like big, bad, evil, big corporations and small scale capitalists as somehow inherently better, I would say is wrong. So that's why I was shaking my head when Peter said, the mom and pop store. In fact, sometimes those large corporations, because they're so large, are bigger targets for unionization and are often able to offer better forms of, worker protection, better environmental problems, or environmental programs, and are also usually more in the lead on a variety of social issues. So I think this is one of the things that was foregrounded in my article, that focusing on size or corporations misses the point. The family businesses can be just as, if not more, exploitative. A few other things that I focused on there, which I was trying to target things that are, very prevalent in left-wing discourse and in some ways may serve some important strategic end, but can conceal deeper problems. One is the pervasiveness of greed as an analysis of capitalism. Well, unfortunately, focusing on greed alone personalizes a critique that basically points to a bad apples analysis. It turns a systemic problem into a moral failing, as if we just got rid of those bad, evil bankers, then somehow everything would be better. We replace them with better ones. And there was a film that came out around that time. I think it was called Inside Job, which is not the 9/11 truther one. It's a bad title. But basically in that film, I remember they look at bankers, they study they cite some study that looks at people's brainwaves when they handle money, and they say, oh, it's the same as when you do cocaine. So they even biologize greed as this problematic thing so that we just get rid of these bad apples, everything goes back to usual. It ends with this kind of panoramic shot of the Statue of Liberty. If we just return, if we made America great again. So this points to another problematic discourse that was very prevalent in Occupy Wall Street, and that's economic nationalism. In the early days, there was a group of people wearing purple armbands around Zuccotti Park, and I remember being confused. I don't know what this means, so I asked them, I say, it's purple because when you mix red, white, and blue, you get purple. So this was a very clear expression of this kind of economic nationalist analysis that really sought to pit an evil, demonized Wall Street against a good, pure, folksy Main Street. Again, the problem with this is it ignores that exploitation that's built into the very fabric of capitalism, even small scale forms. Another factor that was in this, and we've actually in this milieu, and that we've seen a little bit also in some of our chats this week, is a focus on conspiracy. And I've enjoyed seeing some of these conversations and some of the responses. Maybe it should have been pink, maybe they're not good color theorists. But in any case, that precisely because of the abstract nature that Peter described of capitalism, it makes it very prone to personalizing critiques that see it not as a systemic form, but as shadowy individuals working behind the backs of man, as Marx famously put it. So it makes conspiracy thinking especially attractive. But the problem is it's not a conspiracy, right? It's like right out in the open. We can see how capitalism works. We can understand its logic. It doesn't require the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, Gates, Soros to be pulling the levers behind it, which isn't to say that there isn't collusion and things like that. It does happen, but it's not the exception to any kind of rule, which leads into another problematic framing, and that's focusing on corruption, because it precisely focuses on an exception to the rule when, in fact, the problem is the rule of capital. Okay, just to summarize, I mean, that's more or less is the point. To single out any of these elements of capitalism misses this deeper point that all capitalist enterprise exists for one reason and one reason alone, and that's to produce profit, to expand. I know Peter might take issue with that particular framing. We could also say to accumulate capital, but in any case, not to meet human needs. Okay, so these analytical points are not abstract because they lead directly to this bigger question: what can we do about capitalism? And Peter mentioned that he normally does a little bit on this. We're at 11:20 now. So Peter, do you want to, well, what I had in mind actually was another very brief brainstorm. And maybe if we want to add on that, you want to add on that afterwards, that can be kind of our segue into the breakout groups. But I wanted to ask folks, you know, if we could do a short brainstorm, what are some existing or historical ways people have organized to confront, challenge, capitalism? I actually, while people are sharing those in there, I want to just address Gary's point and why, I don't know if Peter made this point exactly, but part of the problem of focusing on profit alone is look at how many corporations exist that are really pillars of the current capitalist world that do not make a profit. Lots of them. There's tons of startups. It's about the potential for you know, greater accumulation later on, and there's a whole logic to this. The capital also needs investment opportunities, right? It can't just sit on that. It needs to actually store capital in various modes. So a lot of those won't make money, and that's fine. Peter, you want to? I don't know if you want to add on to that.
Sure. Thanks to Gary for raising this. It's a great question. I agree with Gary that conception of profit as the driving or as a driving force, I agree that that's central to an important chunk of Marx's analysis. And I have, even though I'm an anarchist, I'm one of those anarchists here today. I've learned an enormous amount from Marx's analysis of capitalism. I'm not always as fond of other Marxist analyses of capitalism. Marx's own work is brilliant, enormously problematic in 1,000 ways, but brilliant. And I agree with Gary that it's hard to parse the other stuff that Marx says if you don't grant that driving force to profit. The reason why I disagree with that is it has something to do with what Blair just said, that a whole lot, some of the most famous companies in the world premised themselves. Amazon, for I don't know how many decades on end, lost money out the nose, and it's still, I don't know, what is the third largest capitalized corporation on the planet or something. right now. It's an arcane debate in some ways, but the way I'd put it is, I think the accumulation of capital as such, I see that as the driving force. And I'm not convinced by Marx or others that that typically happens via profit generation. I know that that mixes up empirical claims about what actually happens in the capitalist world with theoretical claims about what's essential and core and necessary. As far as I'm concerned, when you come down to it, that's not the most decisive distinction. I think a person who insists that profit must be my fifth element of my four core elements, I think that person and I, who says actually profit's secondary or tertiary, I think we might come to a very similar analysis of the rest of the ensemble. Some of the other disagreements, as I'll argue later after our break, I think are probably have a bigger impact on how we try to change the systems that we are opposed to.
I would just add one more note to that, Peter. Another way of possibly thinking about that is that profit generally, not exclusively, but conjures this image of kind of the end of production pipe, right? You sell things and the profit is what you make at the end. And another problem with this is it tends to occlude the kind of non-waged labor and non-waged forms of expropriation that take place within capitalism, whether that's dispossession of land, whether that's the unpaid work of largely women and folks of color in social reproductive roles. These are also part of it is a terminological problem, right, of how we understand profit. But if we focus on that in terms of like economic end of pipe money alone, it can have the problem of kind of obscuring these other ways that capitalism creates value and sucks value out of other forms that aren't necessarily profit strictly or narrowly understood. So thanks for that clarification, Peter, and we can talk about this more. This is usually the most contentious point, but I see folks have been adding to the brainstorm, and I'm just going to read a few of them. Barter and gift economy, and to restate, yes, someone said it, historical or contemporary ways of challenging capitalism, working towards a planned economy, organizing workplaces, food sovereignty, recommunization of land and property, communism, socialism, oh, that's privately, but I think that was an accident. I think I meant that for everyone. Anarchy, syndicalism, trade unions, cooperatives, alternative currencies, increase of worker bargaining power, building dual power, unionization, paradigm shifts, participatory budgeting, commoning, expropriating workplaces. Okay, great and very wide-ranging examples. Peter, what do you think? Do you want to talk briefly about your bit, or maybe I think we should probably go into breakouts now, and we can kind of bring that to the conclusion. Sound good?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I will reshare the questions. 1 second.
That's a good question.
And of course, feel free to add your own. We have 30 minutes left, so why don't we do 20 minutes, and then we'll have 10 to come back, and we can also maybe add 5-10 minutes on the end if folks. Oh wait, no, sorry.
An hour and 30 minutes left.
Right, thank you. Losing track of time between all the time zones. Okay, so I'm gonna get some breakout rooms, and let's do 25 minutes then, because we have time. And we'll do 7 to keep them smallish, so it should be 6 or 7 per person, per room rather. And 25 minutes, sound good? Okay, we'll see you all on the other side. Okay. Give everyone a minute. Are we all back? Peter, are you with us? I don't see you. That's odd. It looks like the group is smaller. I don't know if some people had to leave or if that didn't include Peter. While we're waiting for him to return, maybe we can just hear a little bit from the breakouts, what people discussed, some common themes. Anyone want to volunteer to start off?
I can start.
Cool.
So my group was Max, Matthew, Joe, and Nadine, all working on really interesting projects. And we focused a lot on the fourth question, just organically. Well, I guess I'll start with kind of the last point that we discussed, which is the idea of how internalized capitalism is in our imagination, and that, you know, part of overcoming it requires transformation within ourselves. And we discussed different kinds of origin stories and mythologies that kind of ingrain kingship and queenship and patriarchy and otherness of the self and the land. And Joe taught us a lot about ancient Sumer, which was very helpful because I like blaming Rome for everything. But turns out a lot of this Mishigas started in ancient Sumer. And maybe you remember, Blair, which article this was. I was trying to remember, discussing the Epic of Gilgamesh, and sort of this origin story of the patriarch in that, but it might have been like a Rojava newspaper. I thought it was through the ISC stuff, but
No
anyway.
Bookchin's written about that. It might have been a Bookchin article somewhere.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, so yeah, just the origins of that, how embedded it is in our minds, and some really good reading materials proposed by everybody, including Bookchin's Trotskyite Years, David Graeber's Debt. We talked, Federici came up, and oh yeah, and then the idea that resistance to capitalism needs to be global was also a point made by our group. And I think if I didn't miss anything, anybody wants to add anything? Okay, great, thank you.
Great. Already lots of points of commonality with our group. Thomas, do you want to jump in next, actually?
Yeah, sure, I can go. So, sorry, in my group, we were Lily, Forrest, Gary, Blair, and myself. And yeah, most of we didn't really follow the 4 points because there was a lot to think about and to discuss, but most of our conversation still stayed on the level of, is profit or not a core characteristic of capitalism? And there was some interesting debates and things being said there. Also, we talked a little bit about, the over-complexification of capitalism since neoliberalism and the finance aspect of it. Lily, maybe, I don't know if I'm oversimplifying what you're saying, but like how when Peter was saying that we sometimes feel like we need a PhD in economics to even understand what's going on. So there was a little bit of thoughts on this, and we also, yeah, talked about the fact that it's internalized, and that since like Thatcher and Reagan and the TINA, like that there's no alternative. And Forrest was raising the point that like around, like in his circles, most of the people he know are anti-capitalist, but it's very hard to even imagine something else or where to start to overcome it and to fight it. And we also touched some points on the origin of capitalism and if it derives from feudalism and slavery. And yeah, that's about it. I also, one point that I was trying to raise, and maybe that could be a question to Peter. Is Peter around? Is he there? Yeah. I was just wondering, yeah, about point 3, like if I was trying to talk about the negative interest rate as one of the solutions to overcome or to transition capitalism into some other form, as a form of decay, like that there is to fight accumulation of wealth that is going on an astronomical level these days. So to put some kind of decay on money that would force people not to accumulate it, but to make it circulate, and to make it circulate maybe into more environmentally or like some other values that we would agree on as humanity. And yeah, so I mean, just to maybe hear a word about negative interest rate, and is that possibly a good solution?
Thanks, Thomas. Another group want to volunteer to go next?
I can go.
Oh, go ahead.
All right. Well, in this case, our group was Joe, Vania, Laura, and Jan, and we discussed on the first question about what is capitalism, how they emerge historically, and how has it changed. Well, in this case, we discussed about the commodities, the markets, the labor, and in this case, Joseph made a point about how aggressive it is towards other systems and the need on the offensiveness to the other other elements that are intrinsically in capitalism. Sorry, Laura made a point about the origins and how it emerged in the European colonization and evolved into the feudalism. Now what we have is the more complex neoliberalism, and we focus a little bit on also on the second question, that it was why is important the understanding and the critique, and why does it matter? And well, in this case, we need to figure out how we mention, and they explained to me how we need to identify mostly all of the externalities of capitalism and the vulnerabilities that we need to identify, so we don't get manipulated by these kind of systems. And I think that's some notes that I have. I'm not sure if somebody else wants to add more.
If not, then the next group can dive in.
Okay, I can go. So our group was Haya, Bree, Zachary, Nick, Johanna, and myself. And we kind of just were able to focus on the first two questions. So we talked about capitalism as a set of relationships, particularly around private ownership of the means of production, as a set of class relations. We talked a bit about the history, so the emergence from feudalism, but how capitalism emerged even before the Industrial Revolution. we identified constant growth as one kind of feature or like driving part of capitalism. I said I really appreciated Peter talking about sort of unwaged work and reproduction, as that's like right now, social reproduction theory is my jam. On the second question, we talked about if we're going to call ourselves anti-capitalist, we need to be able to define capitalism and kind of put forward what our alternatives might be. I think it was Haya who talked about with capitalism, and I think maybe it was Peter or Blair who brought this up, but that it's often obscured. So Haya was like, we really need to make its history and operations visible, because I think that's really important, particularly that historical part, as people have kind of mentioned, like imperialism, enslavement, etc. And that it's really necessary to have a structural critique, and oftentimes that can be missing. And Haya talked about, particularly in this moment where capitalism is breaking down, it's a kind of moment of opportunity, but also a dangerous time. Particularly, we see more and more racist and anti-Semitic conspiracies, and how kind of pernicious that is. So I think that speaks to the need for really critical analyses and that actually get to the reality of capitalism. So I'll end that there.
Great, thanks, Alex.
I'll go next. My group was Ginny, Sasha, Kathleen, Jeff, Ollie, and myself. We started out our discussion with Kathleen. She brought up the question about reproduction labor and the feminist critique of how domestic labor is often exploited, things like care and cooking. And her question was, in identifying domestic labor with being exploited, is it only exploited in capitalism, or would exploitation in these areas happen outside of capitalism? Jeff brought up Silvia Federici and the idea that capitalism, the values in capitalism is based on capital and money. So here, these types of activities are not being recognized as valuable. Ginny mentioned that these activities can still be exploited outside of capitalism if there is some sort of hierarchy or exploitative social structures. Sasha mentioned reproduction labor can actually help reproduce other types of labor. And this whole conversation kind of brought up the idea of reform versus revolution, and like, how might we go about fixing the problem. And so should the strategy be to, in this case, fight for wages for this exploited labor, or to fight against the system itself? Jeff mentioned fighting for wages would be problematic. Capitalism is always bringing in new areas of life and turning them into commodities. For example, elder care becoming an industry. And also that in the short term, reforms could be helpful for people in the now, but it further cements capitalism in our lives. Reform can hurt the potential or desire for revolution. So if people see a benefit in what's happening now, they might be less inclined to work towards replacing the system. So just a general confusion as to how we should focus our efforts, what might be a waste of time and what can actually be accomplished. I think it might have been Kathleen that mentioned that it's like a making and an unmaking at the same time. And so there's a potential there for creative acts. So yeah, just kind of generally like chipping away at the problem versus getting at the root of the problem. Jeff offered a possibility that there's possibility in reforms that don't reaffirm the structure, such as the small local food movement that has split regulations. He mentioned via Campesino. And one last comment was, in capitalism, there's the inability of us to see alternatives to it. There was much more in the conversation that I wasn't able to gather, and I hope that I got it all right.
Thanks, that was great. Do we have one other group or?
Yeah. In my group, we were me, 16, Joshua, Mike, Katie, and Ashley. And we mainly focused on the limits of challenges to capitalism. And we started from asking ourselves, what's the position of the social ecology on strikes? Because and none of us had a clear idea what was that. But then we started to think about how a strike could or could not change the revolution system. We shifted to the idea of a women's strike to challenge the social reproduction and challenge the capitalist systems. And from that to the fact that the reproductive work has been increasingly commodified, and so people are dependent on professional care work, so that a care strike could be effective or could not. And we ended on the question how to replace the exchange values in a new hypothetical new society. How can we do it now, and how can it be effective?
Thanks, Giovanni. That was great. So now, have all the groups reported back? Is that the last? A lot of rich discussions and a lot of overlap in terms of theme. Just one more thing on this question. It seems like a lot of people discussed of understanding. Laura, you have a comment or question?
Not yet, when we get to questions.
Okay, okay. In our group discussed it, and sounds like several others did, is this relationship, the last question of how capitalism relates to other forms of domination and oppression, and which ones were historically necessary and contingent. Can we imagine forms of capitalism that are not predicated on white supremacy or patriarchal division of labor? I really highly recommend these two articles in the New Left Review where Judith Butler and Nancy Fraser kind of go back and forth on this issue. And it draws to kind of a broader left theoretical question is, if we understand capitalism as a totality that is kind of encompassing and determining of all different social spheres, or do we think about it, and this is kind of Nancy's position, drawing a little bit on Habermas, is that there are differentiated social spheres. Capitalism is one and an increasingly important one of them, but that can have slightly divergent internal logic. So this has been a hotly debated topic, and it very importantly determines how we understand capitalism and our alternatives to it. Oh, and Capitalist Realism, that's a fire book as well. Thanks for sharing that one. Peter, I wanted to hand things back over to you. And I know we left off with the question of what can be done about capitalism. And I think you might have wanted to talk a little bit about historical and contemporary alternatives. Is that right? Is that where we're heading?
Sure. I'm not sure what we should do with our last 45 minutes, but I'm happy to give a spiel on that. Is that a good
You
time?
mentioned,
I know
that-
we had at least Laura who wanted to weigh in on something or other.
Are we ready for me to ask that? Now?
I think so. I think we're at a transition point, and I'd
Okay,
love to ask
okay.
you take the opportunity.
Yeah, so I actually typed this question in the chat box earlier, but it's the same question that I have, which is about the conspiracy theories. So it is true that you know, kind of the nature of capitalism is that the capitalist class, the bourgeois class, becomes so powerful that it does buy out everything that is supposed to be publicly owned or publicly serving, which means that it does buy out governments, right? And, you know, especially, you know, in our era of capitalism, the transnational nature of capitalism does kind of lend itself to conspiracy theories, even if you really do understand capitalism. So my question is, you know, there are a lot of course, all these rumors and theories about, oh, you know, Bilderberg and the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission and, you know, their influence. And obviously a lot of this comes from like a right-wing libertarian perspective, but I do have questions about whether an international banking and, you know, is there a way that we can understand this from a leftist or social ecologist perspective? Because, you know, I mean, it's true that they do influence things. They do, you know, you look at like neoliberalism that came out of the Montpelier Society, and, you know, they were just kind of hiding in the shadows for a long, long time. And then they foisted this horrifying ideology, and now it's taken over the capitalist world. So, yeah, I would love to know your thoughts on that.
Sure. That's a topic that I speak on and write on a lot. So I'm going to give you an extremely brief answer for now, but I want to acknowledge that you are definitely onto something. I think there is, I tried to hint at this an hour and a half ago. One of the weird things about capitalism as a social system is that it, unfortunately, in my view, it's really good at obscuring its own internal workings. I don't think it's the only important social system that does that, but it's really good at doing it. And that, to my mind, that's an open invitation to the rest of us. Most of us are most of the time excluded from powerful places in society where life-changing decisions get made. And if we're excluded from those processes, it shouldn't be shocking that a lot of us are at least sometimes tempted by what I would see as potentially reassuring explanations that I think are actually false. That's, if you wanted my take on what I think conspiracy theories are, it's more or less that. They are potentially reassuring explanations of genuinely bad phenomena. They are accurately perceiving stuff that is screwed up in the world. They are offering possible explanations for those unfortunate phenomena. Their explanations are sometimes reassuring. I mean that in the sense that, according to a lot of those theories, if we could just get at the source of the corruption, to use a term that that Blair used a while ago, if we could just find the few bad apples who are hidden in the halls of power somewhere, if we could identify them and get rid of them, things would be more or less okay. That is my concern. From a social ecology point of view, it doesn't necessarily matter terribly much what particular individuals happen to be in the halls of power at a given time. The problem is, why are there halls of power? Why are most of us, most of the time, have no access to wherever it is in the world where the decisions are made, whether we conceive of that as a secret meeting of the Bilderbergers or whether we think it's just a boring, mundane shareholders meeting that's right now happening on Zoom, even as we speak here. So from my point of view, the biggest problem with a conspiracy explanation of the world is essentially it doesn't attack underlying structures. It thinks they often think they're attacking underlying structures, but I think what they're actually doing is trying to identify bad actors. And if you focus on the bad actors, my worry is it distracts you from how did any actor get into a position where they get to make decisions like that that will affect the lives of millions and millions of people. Anyway, it's a long debate that is worth having, possibly not worth having right now necessarily. But thank you.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Peter had a video lecture of this that used to be available on our website, and somehow whoever hosted it, it's no longer hosted. But
it's not up anymore?
No, and that was actually the source of at least a few people that told me they got politicized through conspiracy theories, came across this and changed their tune. I think it's worth also historicizing conspiracy theories in this regard. And we've already talked about some of these older ones, you know, anti-Semitic, populist, producerist ones. But I think we can also look at, especially in the wake of 9/11, we've seen an explosion of conspiracy theories on the left, and there's been more openness or tolerance of them, and I would say in many problematic ways, because as Peter said, they identify real problems, but then they offer very false analyses and false solutions that don't challenge the overall structure of that society. And they often resort to very, you know, fuzzy, identifying fuzzy villains like the New World Order. And again, these are very subject to like scapegoating analyses, which typically get racialized in all kinds of problematic ways, and that also tend to legitimize the ongoing daily exploitation, domination, oppression that is part of our lives, because it's just focusing on these like secret, shadowy ones. And if we got rid of those, then everything would be fine. And I think that's exactly the problem with capitalism. And as you said, Laura, why it is so prone to that analysis is because it is abstract. It is something that happens, quote unquote, behind our backs. And when we look for the actors, you know, it's even tempting. There's a whole series of Marxists that have criticized, you know, an emphasis on class struggle and the boss. Like someone named Moshe Postone has really offered a Marxist analysis of capitalism that put capital in the driver's seat, that said, you know, we're not immune to this as workers. We're also caught up in these things. So that's one of the problems with the 99 and 1% frame, is it ignores the way that we also try to maximize value within capitalism. We just do it less effectively than the people who control the means of production. But again, it's not just that we've internalized bad ideas, but we're also constantly incentivized to think as homo economicus and to maximize our outcomes. So even if we, you know, heroically wanted to go and somehow be zero impact man, as that dumb documentary put it, or, you know, to live this purely ethical life, we would quickly become either bankrupt or frustrated or whatever, because that is not possible in a capitalist world. I mean, that's why those who know me know I'm a big fan of Adorno's quote, "Wrong life cannot be lived," which isn't a call for nihilism or resignation, but it's a realization that the world we live in is so deeply structured by capitalism and other forms of domination that an attempt, you know, if you want to try to live purely in this world, you know, join a church. But what we need are political movements that are actually trying to change the state of affairs. And that's the problem with so many of these false analyses, is they individualize, they psychologize, they secretize, they offer all these things that point us away from collectively confronting these problems. And that will get into one that I hope we'll have some time to discuss after Peter's next input. And that's like the emphasis on the left, and especially the libertarian or anarchist left, of economic alternatives as an alternative to capitalism, which, I mean, Peter and I might have slightly different takes on that, but Bookchin had some very important, I think, criticisms of things ranging from, like, you know, CSAs to co-ops, about the limits of trying to create alternatives to capitalism within capitalism, which isn't to say that those are not worthwhile, but that we have to acknowledge those limits. So that's something I think we should also try to address. I'll hand things back over to Peter, though. And maybe we could hold that comment, Laura, and we'll come back to it when we get to the wider Q&A.
Okay.
Does that sound good, Peter?
Sure, if that's okay with folks. Since we have relatively little time left, I'm going to give an extremely condensed version of some of the things that Blair just mentioned. But Laura's question is a great lead-in. In fact, a lot of the stuff that folks said from the breakout sessions make a wonderful lead-in. What I would say is these are the sorts of things that social ecologists just among ourselves have been debating for decades. Blair is absolutely right. Bookchin's critique of the stuff that I became a radical within co-ops and collectives, Bookchin's critique of that was extraordinarily harsh. He and I used to argue about it all the time. These are not the kinds of questions that social ecologists agree on among ourselves, forgetting about the rest of the radical left, most of whom are not social ecologists. So from my point of view, from a social ecology point of view, these are exactly the sort of things that we don't have to agree on. There's no reason to expect us all to magically agree on questions like these. We should be debating these questions. In one of yesterday's sessions, Chaya raised a really an unsettling but a really important point about the seeming disappearance of rational discourse. It seems to be evaporating around us, even as we speak. And I want those of us on the radical left, whether you identify with social ecology or not, I want us to try really hard to reclaim that tradition of reasoned debate. I want us to show the rest of the world it is entirely possible to disagree as vehemently and vigorously as possible while still respecting the other person's humanity, respecting the parts of their argument that you think actually do make sense, even though you're otherwise rejecting everything else they just said. So from my point of view, whatever your stance might be on any of the 24 questions that we've raised over the last hour and a half, what I think is maybe even more important is to recognize something fundamental about capitalism that probably seems obvious to most of us here, but it's worth saying out loud. And that is simply this: capitalism is not some sort of historical inevitability. Whatever you think its core features are, however you think it's actually structured, whatever you think its underlying basic operating principles are, capitalism was not somehow predestined to happen. Capitalism is not built into the laws of physics. It's not like gravity. Capitalism is not, despite what some defenders of capitalism say, capitalism is not inherent in human nature. We know that because most of the human societies that have ever existed were not capitalist. That doesn't mean that they were liberatory. That does not mean they were amazing realms of freedom. It just means capitalism, rather obviously, is a very specific kind of social formation. The way I like to put it is, capitalism is a social creation. It is the kind of thing that was created by human societies. It arose in particular historical moments, in particular places. It is something that people ourselves, in our communities, in our societies, it is something that we made. The reason that matters is, if we made it, we can unmake it. Again, that seems obvious and vague and yeah, so what, dude? But if you think about it, imagine that I had gone on for 40 minutes about the pernicious evils of gravity. I gave you this whole long lecture on gravity sucks, dude. Gravity keeps me from flying. I want to fly. I'm opposed to gravity. I call on all of you oppressed earthlings bound to the surface of the planet. Overthrow gravity. Stop gravity. Crush gravity. If I gave you that 40-minute spiel, if you bothered to listen to me, you would very reasonably respond, Peter, actually, we can't just create something non-gravity. Actually, maybe some of you are theoretical physicists, and you could explain to me, well, it's possible that we could imagine a universe. As far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, gravity's not the kind of thing that we can just, by force of will and by rechanging our social organization, we can't just transcend gravity. Capitalism is absolutely not like that. Capitalism's the opposite of that. If we find a way, and it's a big if we find a way to radically transform the underlying social relationships that created capitalist societies in the first place and that continue to sustain them today, if we can change those underlying societal structures, we can actually transcend capitalism. There is nothing historically inevitable about it, regardless of whatever we might disagree and debate about its particular features. I think that matters a lot from a social ecology perspective. In the really long version of this that I sometimes do, I then launch into this long discussion of these two different tasks. Once we recognize that capitalism is actually amenable to fundamental transformation, it is the kind of thing that we could one day somehow destroy and rebuild on, or if you prefer the language of fundamentally transform, what have you. If we recognize that, I would say from a social ecology perspective, there's two tasks that we want to then face. One task is to try to come up with particular institutional frameworks, particular alternative economic models, either because we've tried them before on a small scale and we know that they potentially work, or because we think they're really worth trying and because of the existence of capitalism, we haven't yet an opportunity to try them. So we want to, one, come up with a series of institutional frameworks that could embody the sort of alternative world, the non-capitalist, the anti-capitalist world that some of us envision. So institutional frameworks is one. And the second one, equally important, is we need to think through what kind of ethical vision could give life to those alternative infrastructures, those alternative institutions. What kind of ethical vision could inspire those alternative institutions? Having a nifty set of alternative institutions without an accompanying ethical vision, that's not really going to cut it from a social ecology point of view. And there's a term that a lot of social ecologists have used over the years. It's not one that we invented. We borrowed it from previous generations of radical workers' movements. And the term is a moral economy. And the idea, moral economy. So the idea there is that we want to somehow combine, on the one hand, that focus on we can actually change the economic infrastructure that sort of governs our lives. That's the sort of thing that societies, if they organize themselves and they think through where they're going in a participatory democratic way, those other sorts of things we can change. But the reason why we want to change them is because we want to transform the ethical content. Institutions like that, social systems like that, they always reflect and embody a set of values. They reflect and embody a set of ethical presuppositions, or sometimes a set of ethical aspirations. And we want to think really carefully through, okay, we know what we don't like about capitalism. Maybe we don't entirely agree on exactly what we don't like about capitalism, but for those of us who are opposed to the existence of capitalism, we have some sense of why we're opposed to it. The question then becomes, several of the breakout groups noted this, if you go out in the rest of the world and you say, I'm an anti-capitalist, people are going to reasonably ask you, oh, okay, what do you suggest instead? I don't think that's a rhetorical question. I don't think that's a fake move on their part. Sometimes it might be a way of rhetorically avoiding it, but actually those folks have a point. What do we suggest instead? And that's where I think the really hard questions come up. That's where it can make a difference, whether or not you think that money, for example, or prices or finance or what have you, whether you think those things are essential to the functioning of capitalism, whether you think they're more secondary or what have you. So if you're able to sort of follow through with this notion of a moral economy, I want to quickly read two quotes, maybe one quote, that will try to convey how other radical left traditions have dealt with these questions. I think that matters. I'm a lifelong social ecologist, but I think one of the things that is incumbent on us as social ecologists is to try to be in a constant, critical, comradely dialogue with other radical left traditions, especially traditions on what we sometimes call the libertarian left, or sometimes the anti-authoritarian left. And there's a lot of other traditions like that out there that aren't specifically social ecologists. So maybe the one quote that I'll choose is from more than a half a century ago. It's from 1957, from a guy named Cornelius Castoriadis. Maybe someone wants to take the time to type that in there. It's a long Greek name, although he lived for his adult life in France and wrote in French. And he was a sort of a famous unorthodox socialist theorist. Started kind of like Bookchin, started out as a Marxist, eventually rejected Marxism. He rejected Marxism because it wasn't radical enough in Castoriadis's view. And in 1957, he was trying to explain what he thought the term socialism meant. And I like this little quote because it's just so different. For a person like me who grew up in the United States of the 1970s and 1980s, that's not what I was told socialism meant back then under the Cold War. This is what Castoriadis says in 1957. Socialism aims at giving meaning to people's life and work, at enabling their freedom, their creativity, and the most positive aspects of their personality, and allowing those things to flourish. Socialism aims at creating organic links between the individual and those around him. Pardon the French grammatical gendered use of language in 1957. Creating organic links between the individual and those around them, and creating organic links between the group and society, last, socialism aims at reconciling people with themselves and with nature. End of quote from Cornelius Castoriadis in 1957. I think that's a really inspiring vision. That's the sort of thing, coming from my anarchist perspective, if that's what socialism means, I think I just might be on board. And I like to do that as a way to expand the horizon of what alternatives to capitalism have historically signified, what they have historically, the connotations they have historically held for a whole lot of people who don't necessarily come from a radical political perspective. Okay, I do want to leave a bunch of time for questions, so I'm going to skip over 17,000 things. Social ecologists, in the process of dialogue with anarchist traditions, with various unorthodox socialist traditions, with feminist traditions, with anti-colonial traditions, all of whom have generated their own, many of whom have generated their own critiques of capitalism. Social ecologists over the years have offered a very wide range of answers to these questions. Again, we do not all agree. In fact, many of us vigorously disagree with each other on various aspects of these questions. But in general, I would say that social ecologists argue one fundamental principle, namely, if we want to try to create a genuine moral economy, a genuinely ethical and institutionally different alternative to the market economy that characterizes capitalism, if we want to create a moral economy, we can't do it in a vacuum. We can't do it just by focusing on economic issues alone. That's a cardinal point for a social ecology critique. If we're going to have a chance of creating a genuine moral economy, it is necessarily going to involve changing the fundamental political structures of our societies. Social ecologists really insist on that point. You can't just separate out the economic from the political from the social, and so on and so forth. I think my own view is that that process is going to eventually mean absorbing economic life and absorbing economic concerns into the broader communal life of every municipality or grassroots community, or whatever your favorite term is to describe the bedrock foundational level of a directly democratic, participatory democratic form of society. I think that's a radical claim. I think that eventually foresees economics as such shriveling in importance. Instead of economics being the thing that governs most of our waking hours, because we're worried about how we're going to pay the rent, or how we're going to get food, or how we're going to get our kids to school, et cetera, instead of being the thing that rules our days and nights, under that vision, economic concerns would still be real. They wouldn't magically disappear, but they would become simply part and parcel of a much larger area of democratic contestation about how are we going to organize our lives together? How are we going to create communities that allow everyone, not just allow, but encourage everyone to participate to the fullest extent possible? And how are we going to create communities that are able to live in a relatively sustainable relationship with their natural surroundings, with the non-human natural world around them? From that point of view, this might sound strange since I spent all this time talking about economic structures. From that point of view, the economic questions are going to reduce in overall importance. Not so much that they're gone entirely, but I do think they're going to be relatively less important than they seem today. To close, I started out by offering these four core principles or core characteristics that I was arguing as a proposal could be seen as the sine qua non, the necessary aspects of capitalism. I'm going to close much more briefly by naming four alternative principles that I think from a social ecology perspective could and potentially should, four principles that should characterize those alternative economic features that many of us are working towards, whether it's in the form of cooperatives, collectives, whether it's in the form of much larger workers' movements, peasant movements, across borders, et cetera, in whatever form it takes. Here are my four basic characteristics that I think a moral economy can embody. Number one, we want those institutions to be consciously chosen. We want our economic institutions in a future anti-capitalist, non-capitalist moral economy. We want them to be ones that people have deliberately designed and deliberately and affirmatively chosen, instead of, as it is under capitalism today, instead of people being forced to do the bidding of capitalist institutions, where people and the planet have to rearrange themselves to fit the needs of capital. In a moral economy, it would be exactly the other way around. Economic mechanisms and economic structures would be there to fulfill the purposes that directly democratic communities give to them in cooperation with their ecological surroundings. So conscious is number one. Second is transparent. In a moral economy, all of our basic economic structures have to be, they must be the kind of things that any member of society is able to grasp, that any member of society is able to understand, at least at a rudimentary level. If our economic institutions do not fit that criterion, that's a problem with the institutions. It's not a problem with the people. The problem isn't that we're too dumb or we're just not taking enough time to figure stuff out. It's a problem with the way the institutions themselves are designed. We want to have alternative economic institutions in a moral economy that are fully transparent, or as fully transparent as they can possibly be, to the people in the communities who are making the decisions about them. Number three, we want those alternative economic mechanisms to be alterable. And all I mean by that is we want to be able to change them as the conditions around us change. As the ecological conditions change, we want to be able to change our social, and in this case, our economic institutions. As our social needs and our social aspirations change, we want to be able to change those basic economic mechanisms. Last but not least, and I will close on this point, I think we want our moral economy and all of our alternative economic structures, I think we want those things to be fully integrated into all of the other aspects of communal existence. I want us to absorb our economic concerns into all of the other things that any society, that any community is going to have to decide together. Whatever those other questions might be, I want them to be integrated into one, if possible, one combined participatory direct democratic whole, so that we don't go into an assembly. If you're drawn to an assembly model, so that we don't go into an assembly thinking, you know what, I work at the local preschool, or I work at the local orchard, or I work at the local bookstore. I'm going to go to the assembly and I'm going to think, how can I get the best deal for the preschool or the orchard or the bookstore? We don't want that to happen. We want to have people live in the kind of moral economy where it is possible and in fact encouraged to put communal well-being in ecological and in social terms, to place communal well-being ahead of our particular interests, our personal interests, our private interests. In fact, if we can, maybe even reconcile and reduce the distance between those two things. I'm sorry that sounds very abstract. I have lots and lots of practical ideas about things that have worked and haven't worked in my experience with co-ops and collectives, et cetera, et cetera. But what I would really like to do at this point is maybe, Blair, do you want a chance to sort of weigh in at the end and then open back up to a general discussion session? How's that sound?
I would just make two very quick comments on what you just said, and then we can dive right into the questions. And that is to kind of emphasize some of the distinctive and radical components of how social ecology understands the economy and the abolition of the economy. And one is this kind of fundamental distinction between justice and freedom that people often, when reading Bookchin, will kind of stumble across and think, justice, this is kind of the core of the left. And he makes this really beautiful critique in the ecology of freedom, where there's the statue, the classic statue of justice, right? That's holding the scales of justice and is blindfolded, you know, in order to be impartial. And he says, actually, no, she's blindfolded because she's so embarrassed that she actually has to like weigh things out, that we're nitpicking, that we're bean counting in this way, which is such an affront to, like, you know, earlier forms of communist gift economies, for example, where things were just, you know, freely given without keeping track of those. So I think that's an important distinction to keep in mind of, like, how justice orients us towards distribution, where freedom is a little bit more of an expansive of a category. And I guess related to this in terms of how we think about the economy and the political sphere and, like, workers versus consumers. Peter had this great debate with Michael Albert, who's one of the main thinker of participatory economics, or Pericon. And they've got, there's a lot of overlap between these two libertarian socialist traditions and some small differences. But I think one of those differences, his alternative vision centers very much on produce workers and consumer councils, right? And there's this process of kind of coordinating these two to come to some agreement. And that all sounds good and well in the current world, I guess. But I guess social ecology, and Peter's point is he's trying to, what we ultimately want to do is think beyond these limited identity categories and roles of either worker or consumer. We want to get beyond those. We want to think about them in terms of what we want rather than the kind of roles that are foisted upon us, to get beyond this kind of inherently somewhat antagonistic or potentially antagonistic relationship there. And I think that's another thing that's worth bearing in mind. Okay, with that, I think we should turn things over to general discussion. So we would like to get on stack. Max, Joseph, why don't we take a couple and then we can. So why don't we start with these four: Max, Joseph, Lemmy, and Marielle.
Cool. So this has been a great session, first of all. And I think that approaching all of this from a primarily moral standpoint is really interesting and novel to me, and still at the same time sits well with my background, with one exception, and that's what I'm trying to kind of reconcile, and that's I'm a Marxist. I am wondering about this distrust for the class critique, and the context that I would give for that is that I think that one of the strengths of the class critique is that it can kind of facilitate this strategy whereby we're able to create unity and create unity in order to bring about larger revolutionary change. I of course am not saying that Marx has it exactly right, Lenin has it exactly right, etc., etc. I think that there's a need to incorporate the vast wealth of new critiques of oppression that have come about in the last 40, 50 years. And I'm kind of wondering if you two as facilitators would have a strongly different position, just kind of looking for thoughts on that class critique, because to me it's again potentially one of the only successful facilitators of revolution to capitalism thus far. Yeah.
Max, great question. Joseph?
Yeah, I wrote down my question. So thinking about whether it's social ecology or capitalism or whatever, something else, do you think any given socio-political system philosophy must inherently be intolerant to any form of socio-political pluralism?
Very interesting, potentially provocative question. So Lemmy and Marielle?
Yeah, very quick question. You can, goes out to all folks in the chat as well. I want to know of examples where of places where moral economies are pretty dense and robust. So places like Northeast Syria and Cuba, maybe Chiapas come to mind, but if you all could just elaborate on a couple of examples and resources in chat, and if Peter, you could respond as well.
Okay, let's take Mariella's and then we'll take a shot at these four.
Yeah, this just kind of extends from what you brought up about the antagonistic kind of dialogic relationship between justice and freedom. And something that's kind of been weighing on me is how do we advocate for and embody expansiveness without, I guess, ignoring or relieving ourselves of responsibility when it comes to justice and reparations and all of these really urgent things we're thinking about right now.
Fantastic question. Peter, you want to start us off? Take any of those?
Sure. Boy, these are all great questions, and I can't address all of them. The last one is tremendous, and it points to one of those ongoing debates among social ecologists. I know on the basis of talks with Chaya and Blair and other people over the years that there's not a consensus on this issue. So very much my own peculiar personal view on that question is, I think that hidden in that chapter of The Ecology of Freedom, which is maybe the central chapter of the vast and sprawling book, the one that Blair mentioned, I think that hidden in that chapter, Murray would have disagreed with what I'm about to say, but I think nonetheless there's a substratum there that suggests a kind of a dialectical interrelationship between justice and freedom. I think that the way he formulated that in 1982 or 83, whenever that book came out, I think it was polemically, for good reasons at the time, polemically pointed against an overemphasis on justice. And he wanted to compensate for what he saw at the time as a lack of attention to the much broader rubric of freedom, at least as he understood it. And he was right to do that. But nonetheless, I think we can recalibrate that for a 2020 perspective. So what you just pointed out, the historical moment we are living through right now is amazing to me. It's breathtaking, the changes I am watching, primarily among my white neighbors and family members and colleagues, et cetera, et cetera. It's astonishing to watch the rapidity of those changes. I have no idea how much of them are going to last. But for right now, it's remarkable to be living through this historical moment. And it seems to me, this is not the time to be saying, yeah, justice, forget that stuff. Let's go for freedom. Let's go for the whole hog or what have you. I would say if we can look instead at a dialectical interrelationship between the two, in the sense that some demands for justice, if we flip them the right way, they can actually lead us toward freedom rather than distracting us from a campaign for freedom. The last other thing that I'll try to, I'm sorry to skip over several very great other questions. That question about socio-political pluralism is fantastic. It's true that sometimes, like in the debate I had with Michael Albert that Blair mentioned, I fall into a bad habit of saying, no, here's the way a good society could actually work. Think about this model. That's always a danger. I think radical thinkers who are drawn to the utopian tradition, Dan, among others, has made an impassioned argument for us to reclaim the good aspects of the utopian tradition, a wonderful argument. But I think there's a temptation there, if you are drawn to those utopian traditions on the radical left, there's a temptation there to think, you know, we've got the right model. Let's just make that model. Let's instantiate our vision. Let's create it in the real world, and then people will somehow accommodate themselves to it. I think that's backwards. I think what we want to do is actually try out a bunch of different radical alternative models and see which ones actually fit people's real circumstances, in part because there's an enormous diversity of human societies on the planet. A model that works well in my little neighborhood in Milwaukee, Wisconsin may not work so well for a peasant cooperative in Nicaragua, just to choose one of the many, many, many examples. And if we can have a more of a, in the same sense that many of you who've been involved in activist struggles over the years, you're probably used to the term diversity of tactics, where you don't just have one model of this is what you can and can't do at a demonstration. Instead, there's multiple possible models. I like to transfer that notion from a diversity of tactics to a diversity of strategies for longer term social change. Even though I happen to be strongly committed to several of those strategies because I find them more promising than the others, I just don't think there's much point in saying, yeah, we've got the true and right way figured out. Everybody must follow it. That's a mistake that too many generations of radicals have fallen into, and I would like us not to fall into it. So thanks to you all for raising it.
Yes, we could talk about all these things for so long. I think the pluralism one thing I think is just everything Peter said is great. And I think direct democracy, another way of thinking about it is thinking about it in terms of self-determination. And there's a lot of space there. And one of the reasons that, for example, Bookchin was very critical of consensus and favor majoritarian rule, because he wanted to create space for people to disagree and to make the case and to also make it easier to overturn the majority decision with a 51% versus a 75 or 100%. So that was a way of also preserving the integrity of minority positions and making decisions easier to reverse. I also just want to point out that we should keep pluralism in mind also in the context of market society, which that has always been a very strong argument for neoliberalism, is that it encourages some form of pluralism, that, you know, absent an overbearing state hand that's going to, like, you know, engage in all this social engineering, it's hard to come up with a better thing than the soft power of the market, where at least we can have our consumer needs. So I think that's like very much embedded in a lot of those discussions. And just thirdly on that, I think we should also not, I mean, we should make those cases, but I think we want to avoid the kind of post-truth scenario where we just say like everything goes. And there's a reason that Murray was such a critic of like cultural relativism and postmodernism, because if we say that everything goes and everything has equal legitimacy, then it makes it very hard to make a case for radical transformation of society. So a revolutionary politics is one that wants to end the world as it is and wants to make very clear, concrete arguments about that. So Murray has some very interesting writings where he's saying, like, I have no problem going into a traditionalist community of da-da-da-da-da and saying, yes, I want to overthrow all this stuff. And this relates to a lot of arguments about epistemology, about enlightenment, about secularism, and about, you know, not being a communitarian analysis that just wants to go back to, you know, some kind of unbroken community. So this to me also points to Max's question about Marx, class, and moral economy. I share a lot of those concerns. I wear two hats of social ecologist and Marxist critical theorist. I think that you can't overlook class as a strategic orientation that offers a lot of you know, shared interests against a ruling system. I think there's a tendency, once we talk already about morals, we're talking about abstractions, we're talking about ideas which are not unimportant, but they also don't have the kind of motivating factor or capacity as shared interests. So I think, you know, I've been trying to make little provocative points in some of the chats and discussions about post-colonialism, for example. Any decolonization, I think any politics of decolonization has to take into account the fact that indigenous people in the United States are 1% of the population. In Canada, they're 5%. African Americans in the United States are 12% of the population. So what does this mean for democratic politics? Who is the agent that's going to enforce, in a period of generalized austerity, a demand for targeted reparations for African Americans when a lot of people are seeing their you know, standard of living decline? I'm not saying that is not a morally just demand. Absolutely, obviously it is. But is it a politically feasible one in the current moments? And I side, I guess, with a lot of contemporary Black Marxist critics like Adolph Reed, Cedric Robinson, who say that no, it is not. It's better to tie these into a more general and universalistic argument, because I think what we're seeing at the current moment is actually particularist demands are being used as a cudgel against more expansive universalist demands. We can see that, how neoliberals are trotting out a very superficial politics of race and sex to beat back the tide of, like, you know, however flawed, more universalistic and arguably more you know, transformative into the overall shape of the society, not just the complexion or the personnel involved. So, oops, sorry, the Silvia Federici lecture I've been exporting just popped up on my screen and started talking to me. Okay, so anyway, I would just say that I think that our class, Rethinking Social Transformation, tries to think together the Marxist and social ecological traditions in a way that gets beyond a kind of reliance on moralism. And I think there's elements of Murray's work, actually his essay on the moral economy, I find actually very problematic for some of those reasons. His attempts to, I think a better way of thinking about it is we want to democratize the economy. And of course, we can think about what ethics we bring to bear in making those decisions, but already in that essay, you can see what moralizing the economy for him looks like. He says some really weird stuff about, you know, secretaries dressing like dashing, like prostitutes, and board accountants looking like dashing pimps and all this stuff. So it lends to this like very, you know, moralistic critique that I find very problematic and normative in lots of ways. So anyway, I'll leave it there. There's lots more rich material to discuss on all these topics. Why don't we, I think we can go a little bit over if folks are willing and able. If folks aren't, we're done for today. We'll start back up tomorrow at 10 a.m. with part 2 of Grace and Brian's class on food and climate justice. So we had Joshua, Laura, and Jeff were the last folks. And sorry, I'll have to scroll back into the stack. But if you folks want to ask your questions.
Sure, yeah, this has been a super nice session. Thanks for all the insights. My sort of queries, I don't know if it's really a question, but I'll just elaborate a little bit. I've been thinking a lot about a lot of what we're talking about relates back to the sort of reductionism of capitalism of the qualitative aspects of life into quantitative things, and how like commodification requires that process, that sort of abstraction of life into a commodity. And then a lot of what we talk about is like the liberatory society, the good life is very much, I mean, it is in terms of material quantitative needs, but it's also in terms of like qualitative needs. But a lot of the time that can't really factor into capitalism. It's like that, like the idea of the qualitative is sort of disregarded. And I guess I'm wondering about that, the relationship between how we sort of articulate that, the need for like qualitative changes when so much of the decisions that are made must be based on like quantitative data. Like no one believes you about a change. Like you can't put forth an argument unless you have some kind of quantitative data to back it up. You know what I mean? So I guess that's I don't know if that's really a question, but that's what I'm musing on.
Thanks, Joshua. Laura and then Jeff.
So I had actually 2 things that I wanted to respond to that came up. The first was in response to the whole conspiracy thing that I asked earlier. I feel like the right-wing critique or the right-wing conspiracy theories are very much exactly what you were saying, which is that they're kind of looking for bad actors to avoid throwing out the entire system. And that, of course, even in a lot of cases, that takes anti-Semitic or racist overtones, xenophobic, etc. But I feel like there's also, I guess you could say, left-wing side to that, where rather than looking for bad actors to maintain capitalism, it's anti-capitalist, but it's more an issue of wanting to stay one step ahead of whatever machinations the ruling class are up to. Like, for example, I'll say that in my case, you know, I kind of was going in that direction for a while, and it really started with reading Noam Chomsky, because I was finding out all of this stuff that was going on behind the scenes in terms of U.S. foreign policy that sounded like conspiracy theories and yet certainly wasn't. And you know, so I think, you know, it can also be an issue of, oh, you know, I need to kind of be on top of this so that I can warn people. Because if no one's paying attention, then they'll be able to do these things and get away with them, and then nobody will be prepared to, and they'll just be at their mercy. They'll be vulnerable to them. So I wanted to bring that up. And the other thing that I wanted to bring up was just this question of the dialectic between justice and freedom, because I've been very involved in, I guess you could say, the social justice community for the last 5 or so years. And I have really noticed, actually, over time, what I think Murray Bookchin might have been getting at, because this, you know, over the fixation on justice, I think, you know, and not on freedom, or has really kind of led into this direction of what I would call, really, in a way, a politics of resentment in a lot of ways. And, you know, it's very, the focus on privilege inequalities is very important, but I feel like when you fixate on justice as opposed to liberation, you tend to focus more on this privilege inequality and miss the overarching structures of power and the fact that these privilege inequalities are actually a sign that even the more privileged people under that system are not free, because privilege is almost like a trinket that is given out in exchange for freedom. Oh, well, you know, if you stay under this oppressive system, you will be the privileged ones under that system. So I feel like that's led in some ways that are really actually, in some ways, you know, then you become kind of like dependent on this authoritarian system to enact justice. And then you become more entrenched under that. And, you know, I've even seen a lot of elements of kind of like mob justice tendencies coming out of that, and even like increased support for, you know, like carceral feminism, or even increased support for the death penalty, which I never thought I would see on the left. So I wanted to kind of bring that up as a question about that dialectic between justice and freedom, you know, and something to look at.
Thanks, Laura. Jeff, a comment? A question?
Yeah, so one thing I've been thinking about kind of through this whole intensive, but I thought this was a good talk to bring it up in, is like, so my personal background experience is rural. I'm from a farming family, and my kind of politicization was rural focused. You know, like the first people I was reading and whatever was, you know, Che Guevara. A lot of experiences I had in rural Guatemala were influential in kind of my worldview and whatever. And I kind of wonder what either of you think about the idea that because rural areas tend to be sacrifice zones and benefit less from capitalism than more urban areas, that they tend to be better suited for building anti-capitalist institutions, where because people are used to working somewhat outside of that system just for survival anyways. So I was just looking to get kind of an opinion on that position.
Okay. Peter, you want to tee off on any of these, and then we'll just start to wind things down?
Sure. I got to go myself in maybe 13 minutes. But thank you all for those of you who've been able to stay. This is fantastic. This is an extraordinarily high quality discussion, I have to say. And I like to think that we have pretty high standards anyway, so that is saying something. I can respond to the last two things. I apologize. This is not fair. I'm a bad teacher in this regard, but they're the ones most recently stuck in my brain. So forgive me for doing it in this direction. But very briefly about the rural communities. That's a fantastic question. If I did not live where I live, I think I would sort of 100% agree with the positive part of what you said, that positive potential for the centuries-long dispossession and exploitation of rural areas, to use that as a kind of a powder keg on which to build radical transformation. Maybe the problem is that I do live where I live. And in Wisconsin, the last 15, 20 years, so far, this could change tomorrow, but so far we've seen essentially the opposite. We've seen a move toward, an ever stronger move toward the right, a more and more set of reactionary responses. And the bizarre thing is, or maybe the logical thing is, that those reactionary responses are responses to real acts of ongoing dispossession and systematic disempowerment of these shrinking and aging Wisconsin rural communities. If anyone's interested, there is a fantastic book by a sociologist, Kathy Kramer is her name, C-R-A-M-E-R, called The Politics of Resentment, where she did all of these interviews with rural communities around mostly northern Wisconsin. That I think is really worth grappling with and wrestling with. The other thing is about several of the things that Laura said. The best part I can say about the conspiracy thing is very brief. I think I read Chomsky differently on that score. If I am reading him right, which is a big if, the guy writes, you know, I've read maybe 6% of what he's written over the decades, but if I'm reading him right, I think what Chomsky is actually offering us is exactly the kind of critical structural analysis that I was asking for. On the relatively few occasions where I've seen interviewers ask him directly, Mr. Chomsky, what are your views on conspiracy theories? He has been harshly critical of conspiracy theories. His take was a little bit like mine. I think they distract us from the underlying structural problem. So I guess what I would ask for I know a lot of people who have a left version of conspiracy thinking. And my basic question to them is, what does a conspiracy framework add to a critical structural analysis? If it adds stuff that isn't already there, that isn't accessible via a critical structural analysis, then I'm going to be open. My ears will be listening to see if you might convince me. If it's not going to add anything, it's just going to make you sound more normal to your aunt and uncle. Nothing against my aunt and uncles, whom I love. That's not good enough for me. I want to see what it's going to help us do in terms of making sense of an extraordinarily confusing social scene. Last but not least, what Laura raised about that, the trickiness of that dialectical relationship between justice and freedom. My own take on this might sound strange for some other social ecologists, but I basically think that human beings in general, all of us, we're extraordinarily flawed creatures. And to my way of thinking, any human society is always going to face these fairly deep wells of irrationality. I think, I might be wrong, but I think that's actually potentially inherent in human nature, even though things like capitalism quite obviously are not. If we somehow magically move to my own personal private utopia, my own personal anarcho-communist, feminist, anti-racist utopia, if that magically appeared in Wakanda tomorrow and I got to move there and be part of it, we would still face those deep wells of human irrationality. I think that's part of living in societies. If you're not a hermit, you're going to face those things in your life. And I think the best way to respond to that is not to deny it, but is instead to say, okay, I want to recognize that all those other people out there, the people in the boring center, the people, which describes most of my beloved family members, the people in the boring center and the liberals and the conservatives, the people on the far right, the people on the far left, all of those people, what they're actually doing in their own weird ways is they are trying to meet this longing, this yearning they have, this desire they have to make whole a society that has been broken. Because they all recognize it's broken, except for the few who are sitting on top and are just fine with everything because it's working for them. Everybody else recognizes this thing's not working. This thing's broken. And the trick comes in, why is it broken? How did it get broken? And how can we make it whole in a way that's not going to be worse than what we already have here? If we can have those kinds of clear-eyed, honest, critical debates with each other, that is where my hope for eventual radical change lies. That's it.
Thanks, Peter. I think that's a perfect spot to end on. Thanks for fantastic input, and to everyone for making this a really rich conversation. We'll be putting it online soon, so you can refer back to it. And other folks who join us later can check it out. We are concluding for today now, and we'll pick up again, as I mentioned before, at 10 o'clock tomorrow with part 2 of Grace and Brian's class. And tomorrow is our last day. We'll have a kind of closing session and wrap up after that, after a little lunch break. So again, fantastic conversation, a lot to think about, great questions. I'll be referring back to these chat logs to comb them for insights. Please, folks can sign up for the Discord to keep it going and add to it there. And enjoy the rest of your days, and thanks so much for your participation. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye, Peter.